Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts or story in the comments and subscribe to our latest stories. Before I start, tell me where you are watching me from. I wonder which cities and towns will join me in this memory that will follow me for years. When I think back to that day, I can still feel the faint hum of the office lights, the smell of freshly brewed coffee lingering in the hall, and the soft murmur of co-workers shuffling papers at their desks. It was an ordinary afternoon, or at least it began that way. I was in my 40s, settled into a rhythm of life that felt predictable, safe, maybe even a little too safe. Work had become routine, answering emails, attending meetings, balancing reports, and I wasn't expecting anything unusual when my boss asked if I could stop by his office. He said it was about work. That's how it started. His voice was calm but carried a weight to it, like he wanted to say more but hadn't found the words yet. I remember straightening the stack of folders on my desk before walking down the hallway, telling myself not to read too much into it. He was my boss, after all. Conversations about deadlines and new projects were part of the job. When I stepped inside his office, the first thing I noticed was how quiet it was compared to the rest of the building. The blinds were half closed, letting in slivers of late afternoon light that painted soft lines across his desk. He wasn't sitting behind it like usual. Instead, he was standing near the window, hands in his pockets, looking out at the city skyline. For a moment, I just stood there, waiting for him to speak, wondering why he seemed so different from the man I saw in meetings every day. Finally, he turned, offering a small smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Thanks for coming," he said, gesturing toward the chair across from him. "I know you're busy." I sat down, still expecting a discussion about schedules or client calls. But as he began talking, I realized this wasn't about work at all. He spoke slowly, carefully, as though every word mattered. He told me he had noticed the effort I put into everything, how I carried myself through challenges without complaint, and how I often looked after others in the office when no one else did. It caught me off guard. Compliments weren't unusual in a professional setting, but the way he said it felt personal, almost vulnerable. His tone wasn't the formal voice of a manager giving recognition, it was softer, like one human being reaching out to another. I found myself leaning forward slightly, my curiosity growing. I didn't know you noticed," I admitted, my voice quieter than I intended. "Of course I notice," he replied. "Sometimes I think people forget to tell you, but I don't." Something shifted in that moment. It wasn't romantic, it wasn't inappropriate, it was something deeper. Two people who had always existed in a structured, professional space suddenly meeting in the middle of something more honest, more human. The room felt warmer, and I realized how rarely I let myself truly be seen. I had built walls over the years, walls made of professionalism, responsibility, and a quiet fear of being vulnerable. Yet here I was, listening to someone who wasn't asking me to prove anything, just acknowledging what I had always carried inside me. We talked for longer than I expected. He told me stories about his own struggles, times when he felt invisible despite his position. He shared memories of moments when he wished someone had recognized his efforts, and how those memories shaped the way he tried to treat the people around him. Now I listened, surprised at how much of myself I saw in his words. It was as if we were holding up mirrors to each other, revealing reflections we hadn't dared to look at before. By the time I glanced at the clock, the office was nearly empty. The hum of conversation outside had faded, and the only sound was the ticking of the small clock on his shelf. I felt an ache in my chest, not sadness exactly, but a stirring, a reminder that I was still capable of connecting deeply with another person, even when I least expected it. When I stood to leave, he walked me to the door. His hand hovered near the frame, almost as though he wanted to say more but couldn't find the words. Instead, he simply said, "Thank you for listening." I smiled, unsure what else to offer in return. "Thank you for trusting me." As I walked back to my desk, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. It wasn't a grand moment, not something you'd read about in a novel or see in a movie. But it was real. It was two people crossing a line, not of propriety, but of honesty. A line where respect and understanding created a bond neither of us had anticipated. That night, as I drove home with the fading light painting the streets gold, I found myself reflecting on what it meant to be seen. I realized how long it had been since someone had looked past the surface and truly acknowledged me. And maybe that was the start of something I didn't yet have the words for, but something I knew would stay with me. I didn't know where it would lead, or what tomorrow might bring. But I knew this much. My boss had said it was about work, but it wasn't. And that single truth would change how I saw him, how I saw myself, and maybe even how I saw the life I had been quietly living for years. Would you like me to continue with the second chapter now, where the story goes deeper into how their connection begins to unfold outside of that office moment? The following days at the office felt different. Nothing had been said outright, and there was no dramatic change in how we worked together, but beneath the surface, something unspoken lingered. It was in the way his eyes caught mine during meetings, in the slight pauses before he gave me tasks, as though he was remembering the conversation we had shared. I kept telling myself not to read too much into it. After all, it was just a conversation, a rare but honest exchange. Still, the thought kept circling in my mind, why me, and why now? One afternoon, a few days later, he stopped by my desk. He never really did that before. Usually, he called me into his office when he needed something. But this time, he leaned slightly against the corner of my desk, looking less like a manager and more like someone simply wanting to talk. "Are you busy after work today?" he asked. The question surprised me. My first instinct was to assume he meant another project, another deadline looming. "Not really," I replied cautiously, trying to gauge his expression. "There's a little cafe a few blocks away. Quiet, nothing fancy. I thought maybe we could grab a coffee. Just outside the office." His words were careful, almost hesitant, as though he was aware of how easily they could be misunderstood. I hesitated. A part of me wanted to say no, to keep things neat and professional, to avoid questions I didn't yet know how to answer. But another part, the part that still carried the warmth of our last conversation, told me to say yes. "All right," I said softly. The cafe was small and tucked between two old brick buildings. The kind of place you wouldn't notice unless you were looking for it. Inside, the air smelled of roasted beans and cinnamon, and the low hum of a jazz tune played from a speaker in the corner. It was late evening, and only a handful of people sat scattered at the tables. We chose a spot near the window. The city lights had just begun to flicker on, glowing faintly against the dusky sky. I remember the way the lamplight fell across his face as he looked at me, not as a boss, not as someone with authority over me, but as a man carrying his own weight, his own hidden stories. He spoke first. "I know it might have felt unusual, what I said the other day. I've been thinking about it a lot since then. I didn't mean to make things complicated." "You didn't," I said quickly, surprising myself with how certain I felt. "It was honest. I appreciated it." He exhaled, a small breath of relief. "Good. Because I don't often let people see that side of me. Most of the time, I'm expected to be in control, to have all the answers. But the truth is, I don't always. And I think maybe you understand that more than most people." I sipped my coffee, letting the words sink in. He was right, I did understand. I had lived years of being the steady one, the reliable one, the person others leaned on. And in that steadiness, I had learned to hide my own needs, my own moments of weakness. We talked for hours that evening, long after our cups were empty. We spoke about our lives outside of work, the families we came from, the regrets that lingered quietly in the back of our minds, the small victories no one else seemed to notice. He told me about the pressure of always being the one in charge, and I told him about the weight of always being the one expected to endure. The more we talked, the more I felt something soften inside me. It wasn't about attraction, not in the way people might assume. It was about recognition. About finding someone who could sit across from me and say, "I see you," without actually speaking the words. When we finally stood to leave, the cafe was nearly empty. The streets outside were quiet, washed in the golden glow of the streetlights. We walked together for a few blocks, our steps unhurried, the silence between us comfortable. At the corner where our paths split, he paused. "I don't know where this is going," he admitted, his voice low, "but I know it means something." I looked at him, really looked at him, and realized he wasn't just talking about that evening. He was talking about the shift between us, the connection that neither of us had planned but both of us felt. "I know," I whispered. "I feel it too." He gave a small nod, almost as if the admission alone was enough. Then we parted ways, each walking into the night with more questions than answers, but also with a quiet certainty that something had begun that night. Lying in bed, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying the sound of his voice, the sincerity in his eyes, the way our conversation had peeled back layers I didn't even realize I had built. For the first time in a long while, I felt awake, not in the restless, anxious way I sometimes did, but in a way that reminded me I was still alive, still capable of change, still open to unexpected chapters in my story. And though I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, I knew this much. He had said it was about work, but it wasn't. And now, neither was this. The days that followed felt like walking along an invisible thread, delicate, uncertain, yet pulling me forward in ways I couldn't ignore. Work carried on as usual, phones ringing, papers piling up, meetings held in their predictable rhythm. But beneath the normalcy, something had changed. Whenever our eyes met across the conference room table, there was a quiet understanding there, a shared memory of conversations no one else knew about. At first, I tried to brush it aside. I told myself it was nothing, that people had coffee with colleagues all the time. But each time he stopped by my desk, each time he lingered for just a second longer than necessary, I felt that thread tug again. And I knew it wasn't nothing. One evening, after most of the office had emptied, he appeared at my doorway. His tie was loosened, and there was a tiredness in his eyes I recognized immediately, the kind of exhaustion that comes not just from work, but from carrying too much on your shoulders. Still here? He asked softly. I smiled faintly. I could ask you the same thing. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. Not abruptly, not in secret, but with the kind of care that said he needed a space apart from the rest of the world. For a moment, he just stood there, as though gathering his thoughts. Then he sat across from me, folding his hands on the desk. I keep thinking about the other night, he said finally. His voice was low, almost hesitant. I don't want to cross any lines. But I also don't want to pretend like none of this matters. The honesty in his tone stirred something deep inside me. I had been asking myself the same questions: where was the line, and had we already crossed it simply by acknowledging what we felt? I don't want to pretend either, I admitted. But I also don't know what this means. He nodded, his expression thoughtful. Maybe it doesn't have to mean everything all at once. Maybe it just means we see each other differently now. Those words settled into the air between us like a quiet truth. Seeing each other differently, that was exactly it. And in that difference, something new was taking shape. From then on, our connection became a series of small, almost imperceptible moments. A shared smile when a meeting dragged on too long. A pause in the hallway that lingered just a beat past casual. A quiet word of encouragement when the weight of the day pressed too heavily. None of it was loud or obvious. But all of it was real. One Friday evening, he suggested we take a walk after work instead of sitting in a cafe. The autumn air was crisp, and the trees along the street were beginning to turn, their leaves glowing gold beneath the lamplight. We walked side by side without rush, our conversations flowing easily from one topic to another. He told me about his early years, the mistakes he had made, the lessons that had carved themselves into his life. I listened, realizing how rare it was for him to speak so openly. At one point, we paused on a small bridge overlooking the river. The water shimmered faintly under the moonlight, carrying with it a stillness that made everything around us feel suspended in time. I don't remember the last time I let myself slow down like this, he admitted. Me neither, I confessed. We stood there quietly for a while, watching the water move. And in that silence, I felt a kind of peace I hadn't known in years. It wasn't dramatic or overwhelming, it was steady, grounding, like finally remembering something I had forgotten about myself. As the weeks went on, though, I also began to feel the weight of what we were building. It was beautiful, yes, but it was also fragile. We worked together, and the unspoken rules of professionalism loomed over us. I worried about how others might perceive it, about whether our bond would survive outside the quiet spaces we had carved for it. One afternoon, I found myself pulling away slightly, caught between the comfort of what we shared and the fear of what it could become. He noticed. Of course he noticed. Talk to me, he said one evening when he caught me lingering by the door, clearly about to leave in a hurry. I hesitated. I'm just afraid. Afraid of what this might mean, what people would think. He studied me carefully, his expression both firm and gentle. I can't promise this will be easy. But I can promise you that I'll never let it be careless. Whatever this is, it matters to me. And I think it matters to you too. His words settled deep in my chest, dissolving some of the doubt that had been building there. Because he was right, it did matter. And it wasn't careless. It was careful, intentional, built on respect and honesty. That night, as I drove home under the glow of the streetlights, I realized something important. Life had a way of surprising us when we least expected it. For so long, I had believed that my story was already written, that the pages ahead were just more of the same. But here I was, discovering a chapter one hadn't seen coming, a chapter filled with connection, reflection, and the quiet courage to step into something new. And as much as I tried to hold on to certainty, I couldn't deny it anymore. My boss had said it was about work, but it wasn't. It hadn't been for a long time. The turning point came on an ordinary Monday morning, the kind of day that should have disappeared into the rhythm of work and responsibility. But instead, it became a day that still lingers with me, years later. The office was alive with its usual noise, phones ringing, printers whirring, footsteps echoing down the hall, but when I walked past his door, I noticed something different. His blinds were closed, and the faint outline of him at his desk looked heavy, weighed down by more than just paperwork. I hesitated before knocking, my hand hovering near the frame. When he looked up, I saw an expression I hadn't seen before, a mix of weariness and vulnerability. He gestured for me to come in. I didn't sleep much last night, he admitted after a pause. I've been thinking, maybe too much. I sat across from him, waiting quietly. Over time, I had learned that he often needed space to gather his words, and I respected that. Finally, he leaned forward, resting his hands on the desk. I don't want to lose what we've found. But I also don't want it to stay hidden forever, like something we should be ashamed of. You matter to me, more than I ever expected. And I need to know if you feel the same. The room went still. My heart pounded, not from fear, but from the weight of what he had just said. I had been carrying those same feelings silently, afraid to let them out, afraid of what it might mean for both of us. Yes, I said, my voice steady but soft. I feel the same. I don't know what the future looks like, but I know this isn't just passing time. It's real. He closed his eyes briefly, almost as if he had been holding his breath. When he opened them, there was relief there, but also determination. Then let's not hide anymore. Let's figure this out, step by step. Carefully, but openly. In that moment, something shifted. The fear I had been carrying began to dissolve, replaced by a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in years. This wasn't about secrecy or stepping into something reckless. This was about choosing honesty, choosing connection, and choosing to honor the part of myself that still longed to be truly seen. In the weeks that followed, we began to navigate the changes together. At work, we remained professional, careful not to blur lines in ways that would create questions or confusion. But outside those walls, we allowed ourselves to build something genuine. Long walks after hours, quiet dinners at little restaurants, conversations that stretched late into the night. With each passing day, the bond grew stronger, not because it was perfect, but because it was honest. Of course, it wasn't easy. There were moments of doubt, times when I wondered if the weight of judgment or the complications of reality would crush what we had started. But each time those fears rose, he reminded me, in words or in actions, that this was something worth protecting. Something worth nurturing. One evening, we returned to the small bridge where we had stood weeks earlier, looking out over the water. The city lights shimmered across the surface, and the air was crisp with the hint of winter approaching. He stood beside me quietly for a while before saying, "You've changed the way I see everything. Not just work, not just myself, but life. I didn't realize how much I had been going through the motions until you reminded me what it felt like to really live." I turned to him, my chest tightening with a mixture of gratitude and emotion. "You reminded me too. I thought my story had already been written, that I was just filling pages. But you've shown me there's more. And I don't want to go back to how things were before." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of everything we had discovered, everything we had chosen, everything that lay ahead. Looking back now, I see that what happened between us wasn't about breaking rules or stepping outside the lines. It was about finding truth in unexpected places, about opening ourselves to connection even when it came at an inconvenient time, in an unexpected way. It was about respect, about trust, and about the courage to admit that sometimes, life gives us chapters we never saw coming. And so, when people ask me about that season of my life, I smile quietly. Because I know the truth. My boss had said it was about work, but it wasn't. It was about life. It was about being seen. And it was about remembering that even in the middle of ordinary days, extraordinary moments can still find us and change us forever.